Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. Okay, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane LeMaster. And today we are here for episode number 103. We just passed the 100 mark, a few weeks ago, and that was really a big moment for us. We're here today with Dr. Kylie Rogalla. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Shane.
Yeah, of course. And just for the listeners, a little caveat with this episode. Both Kylie and I have our dogs roaming around the professional studios in our houses, and so if you hear clickety clack of toenails, that's probably on my side, and or barking on either side. That's to be expected. So we have lots of guests in our podcast today. My dogs like to make guest appearances every once in a while on the show too. So
and you're back up to 3, I believe, as well.
Yeah.
Same with me.
Nice.
Awesome. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the first question is always, my only standardized question for the podcast that I ask everybody, that is that the podcast name is Conversations with the Mind. And I just want to get a sense from you, when you hear that phrase, Conversations with the Mind, what comes up for you in your idea bank, in your visualization, like what comes up?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's probably a little bit influenced by being able to be on your website and know the visual representation of the way you present the website of conversation or mind ops and conversation with the mind. I'm getting a sense of that. For me personally, it's less of just a snapshot, but it's more of this is a conversation with self in relation to a larger universal energy structure in the world. So it's not necessarily about human connection, but just a connection to a bigger purpose. It has a lot of light to it. A lot of color to it. This idea of who am I in this place, in this moment right now. That's really what comes up for me, I guess, off the cuff. Could probably keep going into, what happens secondary to that, but that's just my immediate impression.
Nice. Well, and you make it pretty apparent right off the bat. There's, these two streams that we tend to focus on. One is our individual self and connection to this greater energy source, or whatever it is you want to call it. And then also individual source points that could possibly be connected with other people. And, tell me a little bit more about that, because you said that you're not seeing that as I guess prevalent or as often.
Yeah. I think the way that I see it is, and this is something I was thinking about before joining the talk today, is just personal reflection. I have, since I was very, very small, my earliest of years that I can recall in memory, have been really, I guess, separated or not interested in small talk. Whether that be when you're 4 years old or 10 years old and you're at a family reunion, or you're new in school or anything like that. What I'm thinking about more with the connection piece is there's something about, my light and my purpose here that unites with other people so much more deeply and so much more intriguing to me than, what do you do for a living? How's work? Where are you living now? Is everything good? That's always been historically difficult for me to engage in and be authentic. And so when I think of authenticity, I think more of that just generalized link between people that maybe isn't spoken of as often as you would think about just checking in with folks, calling somebody, how are you? Do you really want to know? I will definitely go there.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I hate small talk. I avoid conversations with most people just because I know it's going to go there. I get so excited when someone asks me a big question, or like, some people in my gym, listen to my podcast and they'll hear something and come up to me, and rather than being, hey, how you doing? How's your day? they'll ask me like this really deep question. I'll be like,
Yeah.
oh man, like I got to get with you after training today so we can really discuss this. No, I think that's probably why we connect so well together too, because you and I just have these deep conversations about all sorts of things, reality, how people connect with each other, things like that. So yeah, I really like that. I'm right there with you. I hate the small talk.
It's hard. It's not a I don't want it in my life. I want people to care, but I want people to care about who I truly am. And I want to give that back. And I want to make that a safe space.
Yeah.
So that seems to be.
Yeah. So you talked about this connection with people, right? Surface level connection versus this really deep connection. And that's been an interesting sort of thing for me to think about in my own studies of self and of different theories of reality and different religious traditions and things like that. In that, there's this here in the West, we tend to think of ourselves as these individuals, right? Individualistic people. Maybe if you go into the spiritual or religious realm, like we all have a soul or a spirit or something greater than ourself that is part of our concept of self, maybe that we can't see, but that we all sort of are here individually and going to some place together eventually, like after death. Versus in some other traditions, they talk about how we are all actually one organism, right? That we are all one being. We're just fractured sense of one, if one self was fractured into 8.5 billion pieces, that's what the human race would be. And we are all individualistic in a way, but we don't like we have a greater collective purpose in a sense. So I struggle with like all these different ideas of what human beings and what our connection to each other can mean. And like when I'm just not interested in talking to people about surface level things, if I'm actually like disregarding a part of myself because I just like turned down an aspect of myself trying to teach me something, so I struggle with all these things and like how do I spend my time the most optimally, and who do I need to connect with and talk with? It's very challenging.
Yeah, no, I love that. And this idea of 8 million plus people trying to integrate, and maybe unconsciously we don't know that is a drive or that's a purpose, and maybe we're getting some guidance on the way, but we don't understand what that means for us, and we might be scared about what that means for us. So coming from my counselor education background and working with people with existential angst, with life questions, that's very common. I think during the pandemic and the forced quarantining and isolation, this has come up for people in a more visceral way than maybe it ever has before. And I don't know if that's the same with people that you're working with in your practice, with your families and communities, but this idea of what happens next if my predictability of life, like I saw it, and more of that superficial lens of go to work, come home, perform roles, repeat, recycle, repeat, if that is broken up, I think that raises so much of that just authentic angst for a lot of different individuals, I think worldwide.
Yeah, for sure. Existential angst is through the roof right now.
Yeah.
Especially in a culture like ours, and not every culture is like this, but a lot of our media and things like that is fear-based, and so people are already scared, and then these bigger organizations know the psychology behind it because they have psychologists working for them that are making these ads and they know that fear is going to get people's attention, but it's also going to drive people to disconnect, and that kind of scares me a little bit, especially since I've had a number of psychedelic visionary experiences where I would see my individual self or my soul or whatever, but also intertwined with all the different souls across time and space and the earth right now currently, and other dimensions and things like that, but that we're all intertwined and that each person plays a vital role, so that if you were to remove like even one soul from that giant equation, the whole equation would collapse, and so it makes me worry that people are becoming more disconnected in their existential angst as opposed to connecting with each other right? We're all
Mhm.
suffering through this existential piece right here. Why are we keeping that inside? Why don't we talk about death? Why don't we talk about what could happen and what other traditions think about it? You know, it could, this could all be used for good to open
Mm,
us up to that discussion, but that's not what I see. And it's not what I see
yeah.
happening.
Yeah. I think politics also have been, unfortunately, a huge part of how we've made meaning in understanding what that discomfort looks like and where my allegiance or my progress is going. I want to go more towards something that is more unknown. I want to go into self-exploration, or I want to go back into something that is more safe.
More comfortable.
Yeah, and it's very uncomfortable. And I think we're not talking about family systems yet. I'm sure we might get into that, but this idea of what was modeled for us over our lifetime. And, I know a bit about your family, a bit about mine. We didn't grow up in the most, cookie cutter types of families. And maybe that's what brought us into some of this more openness and interest, because maybe we didn't have a choice. But I think now, despite how people grew up, my little blind dog is drinking water like a monster back there. We gave that disclosure earlier.
No, I thought that was a dog tail, like whacking on the side.
No, that's just hydration.
Awesome.
Yeah, but this idea of, okay, now is there a possibility for me to outgrow my old shell? And how old is that shell? If you've been, cut off from other conversations like we're having right now, because family says, that's wooey, that's something that's, I don't know, conspiracy, that's something that's not true, that anything like that, if that has been reinforced for 45 years, and all of a sudden a pandemic hits us and we lose loved ones, maybe some of the people, the voices that said something like that to us for so many years now are all of a sudden gone. It puts us in a place of this, wrestle, this rumble, not to steal too many of Brene Brown's words. She's who I would consider my spirit animal, if she would be an animal. I love all of her work and her conception on some of these things, but yeah, we're being forced to make a decision sometimes to grow out of an old script or an old identity into a potential new one. And I think a pandemic has presented that to us in ways that has not existed for our present lifetime.
I'm going to get a little, I don't know, fractal on you for a second.
Frackle. I like the word.
Fractal, yeah. And that I would say that we're, at its most basic level, like we are changing our identity in every moment, right?
Yeah.
We are literally not the same person we were just the last moment ago, because we have physically, cells that turn over every second. So we're literally not the same physical person, but also my interacting with you here is literally changing who I am on, even if on a small level. So, when people say that, that's another thing, people say that they're stuck in some place, depression, anxiety, they've labeled their identity as something, and sort of, in a way, doomed themselves to a bit of, self-perpetuated suffering, as opposed to realizing like, oh, I can change in any moment. I have this power within me. I'm going to choose today to start making my way back to a place that I would prefer to be mentally, emotionally, psychologically, you know what I mean? Even physically, getting in shape is a process. You don't just snap your fingers and then you're different, but you have the ability to change your identity and who you literally are and come off to the world just by making the decision to do that.
Yeah, if I can go on a small soapbox, and it's not just because it's available for me, as in, teaching students who are in their final year of training to become counselors and going out into the field and practicing. One thing, I can't really speak to whether this be universal across the world, but definitely in Western culture in the United States, we use phrasing such as depression and anxiety. And it is right there. I don't want to actually get up and grab it, but the big purple book that we use in the counseling profession, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, those aren't diagnoses, but we use them almost exclusively for describing just this type of unsettled feeling or attachment to the world or within oneself, the comfort within oneself. So depression, this might either interest people or irritate people, and that's okay. We'll just introduce both. We'll make
Let's ruffle the feathers. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be a dichotomy of that either. It can be a whole spectrum of things, but that's not a diagnosis. Depression is not a diagnosis. There's a diagnosis for a depressive episode. There's a diagnosis for major depressive disorder. A lot of this is dependent on timing, and it's dependent on how many things have been incurring and ongoing for people that are impacting function. And that is so important. When we start talking about mental health and symptomology, how much is our daily functioning actually impacted? Mm-hmm. If we have a down day, if we have a down mood, pathologically, defining that as depression, I think is a disservice for all of us individually. We shouldn't be doing that. We should, this is an interesting, shift on my relationship with myself in the world today. I wonder what I can learn from this, and embracing that a little bit more. I think is such a strength-based place. We want to say depression, and the same goes for anxiety. And I have a bigger soapbox on that part, but physiological versus cognitive anxiety is something I talk to my students about all the time. Somebody doesn't just say, I have anxiety. If a client were to present that for me, if a student were to say that, I'd say, describe what that means. Okay. Are we talking about heart palpitations and, sweating or dizziness, or just that idea of like narrowed focus, something that could be associated with a panic disorder, or something that could be on that line of, diagnostic thinking, versus cognitive anxiety, rumination, staying up at night, thinking about things, worrying about things. If I don't hear anything, I don't know any better. If you take out that big purple book, those are two different, completely separate classifications for treatment and for conceptualizations. But we just too often lump everything together. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Shane, or maybe in your own training with your doc program right now. When I hear depression, anxiety, I don't try to do this outright, but my eyes roll over a little bit saying, okay, that doesn't mean anything to me yet until we hear more.
Yeah, most of my current PhD work, they're training us to be educators or researchers primarily. And so most of my, if not all of my practice skill sets and things like that came from my master's programs. And most of us in my current program come from that kind of skills-based background. Plus I had 10 years in the field in between,
right.
That and doing the PhD. So, and, in my private practice here in Fort Collins, I get to do things my way, and, I get a little bit more freedom as far as like what kind of ethics and morals and values I want to insert into the business, into the company model, and how I approach counseling, as opposed to how I may approach it if I were still working for a community nonprofit, right? That has specific policies and value systems that they want us to embody. So in my current private practice, I have a DSM in the office, but I can't tell you the last time I pulled it out. And I tell my clients, and I was brought up on the DSM, and it was sort of touted as this grand Bible of answers for the mental health field. And then I started learning a little bit about the history of the DSM and how it was created, and how white privileged men were the ones who came up with all these things. And I started seeing it more as a means to classify populations and to lump people together and put them in boxes where they may not necessarily want to be. I saw it as a possible control mechanism, and a way for insurance companies to get paid. So in my private practice, I tell my clients, I don't expect a diagnosis from me. I will not give you a diagnosis because I feel like it does more harm than it does good. It's good for us to identify symptoms and maybe underlying causes and work on those. But for me to label you as anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder, like that label has the potential to follow you around and impact how you think about yourself for the rest of your life. Describing yourself to others as, oh, I'm anxious, or, oh, I'm depressed, that can be so much more detrimental if that is your inner dialogue. And so,
Right. Yes.
so we don't focus on diagnoses in my practice. We focus on symptomology and underlying causes. But another piece that you were saying was, this uptick in existential stress and anxiety. I have certainly seen probably 80% of my new clients coming in are seeking some sort of deeper meaning and purpose type issue in their life, as opposed to coming in trying to work on a mental health specific issue. So I think this is going to be a continuing and growing trend, which is good for me, because psychedelic work, it can be highly spiritually charged. And if people are seeking that sort of exploration of self, then, we can give it to them very quickly. So I like that a lot. But I wanted to talk to you specifically about existential stuff, because that's how I know you, as far as like your interests and your background. And just in general, for the audience who may think that word existential is a huge word, and it is, that's the first time I heard it. Can you just give like a basic overview of sort of where's existentialism coming from, like maybe as a movement, a little bit of its history, what it followed, and what's come out of it?
Sure. I think to go into that dialogue, I would have to go into knowing where I first recognized when I was seeking some, further what I call big T truths. I'm searching for something more universal than just what I'm told to think. And I think that's where my rumble with religion happened in my, early adulthood.
So where my rumble with the government came.
Yeah, right. So we have rumbles in that way of being scripted and something like that, where I had this very spiritual passion itself, but finding an identification, there was dissonance there of if I go to this gathering or if I identify in this way, I'm being told what to think as opposed to how to think, and that happened really early for me. So I have very, very strong visual memories of being in second grade. And I don't know how many of us can think back to second grade. I don't even know how old that second grade is. So I was in music class and Mr. Morgan was my teacher. So Mr. Morgan, if you're still out there in this current life, hello and welcome to Shane's podcast. But I remember going through the TTTAs and, like the ways that we've learned how music works. And I was in second grade and I had this take back experience of actually seeing myself as, not an out of body experience, but it was a sense of dissociation where I was thinking, is this what I'm here for? Is this really important to me? What does this mean? I remember that very viscerally happening that early. And I think that followed me. I became a little bit of a rebel when it came to, conforming norms throughout some of my life. And some of that wasn't necessarily my choice. I grew up in a northern Minnesota town. I was the one student in my graduating class that I knew of whose parents got divorced, that I was the one person I knew of whose father died when you were in your early 20s, and I started to say, is there something about me? Is there something bigger that I need to understand here? And that followed me for a really long time. So thinking about is there a different way to think about this? Is there a bigger reason that this is happening? Was an escape for me, but in a healthy way. If I can think about larger mechanisms happening there, I became more passionate, more excited about that, as opposed to I'm a victim of the universe, right? So we probably all have known people in our lives or even ourselves that say, the world is out to get me, God's against me, whatever. I wanted to start to reframe that narrative a little bit, and that really got me excited. So Shane, going back to part of your questions about existentialism and where it comes from, I do know, studying such, the origins of existentialism, aside from a lot of our major psychological theories, did have its roots in philosophy. So it's older than our psychological theories. So if we think about Freud in the very early 1900s, that's the one that gets the most recognition, but existentialism really did start earlier than that and started as more of a philosophy. Over time, it built into something that was more tangible. But existential theory, when it comes to counseling, when it comes to mental health, has nothing to do with technique. And I think that rubs against Western culture in a lot of ways as well. We want something that we can look at a manual. We want to be able to assign a technique. We want to see the output. We want to see the change.
Evidence-based.
And then we can prove. Yeah. What'd you say?
People want evidence-based.
Yes. Yes.
And
absolutely.
That's just a buzzword right now. That's the trendy thing. And, we're starting to see that evidence-based is not necessarily the best in a lot of the recent articles coming out. So,
yeah. And you know what? I'm also an advocate for, and going back to what you were talking about with the DSM and not wanting to box people, I'm also an advocate for treatment. Mm-hmm. So if somebody is only able to get support through an insurance company, and that's the only way they're able to afford such, giving them a least stigmatizing, diagnosis or something that's tentative, because a lot of the DSM diagnoses do have a time limit on them. So if this is not true for you in 3 months, 6 months, it's no longer relevant. And being able to talk about that with clients, I think, is really important for access purposes. But what they're seeking to change, maybe you and I can dialogue a little bit about that before we go into the full range of the existential history. But what do you see from your clientele as far as what they come in for? If they don't have it scripted, as in, this is my presenting problem, I want this to go away. Mm-hmm. How is that even, presented to you? Because that might be a good foundation for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will go straight into that. There are 3 lines of thought that I had to jot down right now as you just started, the first half of your existential journey talking about it. So there's definitely some avenues that I want to go into based off of what you just said. But as far as how clients show up for me, they show up in all sorts of different ways, but some of the more primary ways, people wanting to know that what they're doing in their life is making an impact, either, in their family or in their community, or, wondering am I this, this lonely human, what is my impact going to be? It's going to be, not worth anything. And therefore, those kind of thoughts are leading to depression and things like that. So just feelings of insignificance, not having meaning and purpose in their life, whether it's a job, or, in my particular practice, I get a lot of people who come in who've had giant psychedelic experiences on their own and don't know what sense to make of it once they're shown this ultimate reality for a brief period of time. And I also have people coming to me who maybe have read something or read the Michael Pollan book or something like that, where they come in and they say, I did not know that these layers of consciousness were available to me to access. And now I'm interested in exploring myself on those different layers. Can you help me? So we offer psychedelic assisted psychotherapies for that. So people can explore who they are beyond their physical self, who they are beyond their concept of Shane or of Kylie, or, you can get past that, and we can experience yourself as what you truly are, one of the ultimate truths.
Yeah. Well, ultimate truths would be something that I started writing down as you were talking there. And that goes into more, I guess, more accessible, from the 60s, 70s and onwards. Yalom's work with existentialism. But even if we go before that, so maybe I should take a step back a little bit through the history. So definitely started in a not physiological, philosophical realm. Yes. But going into World War II. So if listeners here are familiar with Viktor Frankel, I think he was a very foundational person I think about when I'm in this mindset, and is a really good grounding force when we think about our own traumas and everything else going around us, because his theory and where his perspective and existential thought really came into place. So he was a medical doctor in World War II and had a spouse and I think both parents, and I think there was at least one sibling, if not two, but was pulled into Auschwitz during World War II, everybody in this family was killed by force, obviously through those mechanisms. He was asked to be the doctor for people that are in dying states throughout that entire stay for him. And he was really on the edge of death when, they were emancipated, and that finally happened for them and they were freed from that. But he was on the verge of death. And through all of that, through losing everybody, through being abused and physically tortured and being physiologically almost unable to get up for a day, but still being forced to do labor, he really came up with his psychological theory of this, is that the last of the human freedoms, the very last thing that anybody can take away from us, is our choice of how we respond to things that are going on around us and to us. Okay, so his book, Man's Search for Meaning, very, very big plug for that. If nobody's heard of it, it's an easy read, it's shorter, but it talks about some of that experience for him. It also talks about how he made meaning of it moving forward. And his attitude towards what had happened to him was something that even the Nazis and even his abusers could not take away from him. Groundbreaking. And so logotherapy was born from that. So that's Viktor Frankel's primary work. And his spin on existentialism was logotherapy, just really focusing on attitude. If we're having this, locus of control battle, is it the world's fault? Is it somebody else's fault? Or is there some impersonal empowerment that I can really grab a hold to reframe my power in this very moment? He was a big advocate for that. And that's definitely where that comes up for me. But I didn't know, Shane, if you had heard of Frankel, if we wanted to add to that before we go into Yellen, because he's a whole nother player in my sphere.
No, I'd like to ask you a few questions about that. What was the phrase that you mentioned Frankel saying, something about the last freedom and choice, and what was that again?
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, everybody, so this is the best that I can do, but the very last of our freedoms is, the very, very last thing that can be taken from us, which I guess existentially can't be taken from us. The very last of our human freedoms is our attitude towards the world and everything that's going on around us.
So our attitude.
So yeah. Yep.
Yeah, the way that you said it the first time, I think you said the choice, and the way you said it the first time made me think about this, and we don't have to get into this, but this huge tribalism piece going on right now in the country between vaccinated versus unvaccinated.
Oh yeah.
And the discussion about, should people be able to choose what is put in their body versus, doing things for, more of like a communally based orientation. So we don't have to get into that, but that's what it reminded me of, is like, people are trying to take away people's freedoms every day for all sorts of things. And COVID is just one of these politically charged things. Getting back to Frankel, what I like about him so much is his piece on attitude. I employ that myself in my therapies, but also in my personal life, and always have, not knowing that it came from Frankel in this way until you suggested I read his book. So yeah, you can, it doesn't really matter what your circumstance is, that you have the ability, the potential, if you choose to find that silver lining and to make whatever it is you're going through meaningful in some way. And so for Frankel, going through those terrible times, he was able to find a positive attitude amidst the whole thing. And that probably helped save his life in the long run, right?
Correct.
We know that positive attitude helps people heal from physical injury faster, from surgeries faster, from
absolutely.
It is contributed to spontaneous remission cases, people who are terminally ill if they remain positive. And so this whole idea about what your mindset is doesn't only play on perception, but it also has a direct connection, which we're unclear about, direct connection to how our mind body works. And how, if we hold a belief in our mind about ourselves, it can literally change the physiology of our bodies to, boost immune system, to be able to survive, getting limbs blown off in a war situation, right? We can override our physical systems in those ways. And so you said, there's these two ways you can look about existential questions, right? Big existential questions. who are we? What are we here for? You know, all these and a whole bunch more. Some people slip into what I would call like doom and gloom type thinking. Like, oh, now we start talking about death. We start talking about more things labeled more morbid in our culture, right?
Yeah.
And we can become more negative and have almost like a nihilistic view on the world, on the earth, on everything. What's the point, you know, if we can't find those answers? And then on the other side, like the side that you and I have taken, is that we got a glimpse of what that could be, what the potential is there to understand something in those questions. And it drew us in and it made us curious. And then every step of the way, when we would get a little bit of, a little bit of incentive by getting a little answer here and there to our existential questions, it would further propel us into exploring it. So you were talking about second grade. And I do remember second grade quite well, actually.
Awesome.
I remember being the boy on the playground, running around playing kissy games with all the girls. But I also remember in elementary school, I think it was fourth grade, where I had my first altered consciousness experience. Like, we all get dizzy. That was a little earlier, but in fourth grade, I learned stupidly the choking game. We make yourself pass out on the playground. And after the first time I did it, I came out of that and I was like, what was that? Like, that was totally foreign to anything I'd experienced in my conscious waking life. And I was like, that has something there that I need to understand. And I think that is really probably what kicked off my interest initially in other places that we can take our mind, you know, and existentialism is a great pathway to get to some of those deeper questions.
Yeah. And I imagine when you had that experience of playing that game, and I remember, you know, my elementary school classmates getting in trouble for playing that game, and people, you know, passing out and parents getting involved. I remember that part of history, and our ages are the same. So I get that part too. But going back to just briefly, when you talk about silver linings, understanding what is meant by that, I always go back to intention. So a silver lining being not just how do we reframe all of this pain and make it happy? That's not what we're talking about here. It's more of silver lining being, what did I gain from the pain? You know, gain from the pain, as opposed to forget the pain. This is a happy thing. Let's forget about that. But appreciation of the pain and taking that with our development as human beings moving forward.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of stuff in post-traumatic growth, and since you exposed me to that, I've been on a post-traumatic growth high horse, you know.
Okay, good. And I say good as in thank you for that feedback, but also I'm excited for you. It's not an evaluative piece. Sure.
Yeah, and it's so useful in therapy too, you know, helping people understand that they couldn't have been as resilient or as strong as they are now without having had that trauma or whatever it was happen in the first place.
Yep.
And it really hits home with people, and it really starts to give them hope about things that they were not hopeful for about. I use it for myself too, you know, as a way for me to not only reframe the pain, like you said, but be grateful in some way for the pain.
And there's so many ways that takes shape that we don't even recognize, right? I'm thinking about even my ability to be a doctoral student. You know, my father dying suddenly during my master's program, his trust, his estate left me a chunk of money for, he deemed, educational purposes. And from what I knew of my dad, we never talked about long-term educational plans, but there was something there that was set aside. I was able to become Dr. Rogalla and honor his name and his memory without knowing how, you know, universally that really lined up. I think, you know, that's the stuff that makes me excited, where it makes other people sad. You know, it can make some people sad saying that's unfortunate that happened. But my frame of reference is how exciting that happened. You know, how mind bending or mind exploring is that, to consider that there is something. So maybe that's a different conversation, because I don't want to sidetrack on some of your prompts there, Shane, but this idea of coincidence, I am not a big believer in coincidence. I happen to think coincidence means other things, but that has a spiritual reference to it. And I don't pull that into therapy or into counseling because, my accrediting body would not say that is a therapeutic tool. But I don't know what your thought is on that, Shane, too. Just thinking about coincidence, and is that something that is just random? Do things happen by accident? This ties into a lot of the conversation too.
I think for myself, and the listeners should know this, and they should take into account and do some self-reflection on this too, but I come in with my own set of biases, my own set of education, and my own background in multiple types of religious studies. But I think for me, where I'm sitting with it right now, I don't think I believe in coincidence. But I also don't believe that everything is pre-scripted. I believe
deterministic versus what's the other one? Deterministic versus free will. Yeah,
free will.
Yep.
So I do believe that everything happens in sequence because of causes and effects.
Ripples.
Ripples. But I also believe that there are probably 99% of those ripples that we are talking about, we have zero understanding of right now as human beings. Like, these are things that we can't see necessarily that are happening between us, quantum interactions, perhaps. And I do believe that, things are happening exactly in the only way that they could have happened given these particular circumstances that just happened, right? I also believe in, and this is kind of out there, some, what is it? Multiple worlds theory, where, there's an infinite amount of realities happening simultaneously, and different decisions are being made in each reality, just to make it change just a little bit. So we are just living one reality that is a cause of what has just come right before us. But there's no coincidence, and we do, as beings, whatever we are, energetic beings, we have this ability to make choices and to choose parts of our path. Not every part of our path, unless we're completely mindful and in the moment all the time. But we have these abilities to make choices and divert our path in ways that suit larger goals, and I think that's a really unique ability as human beings and human soul bodies to be able to do. But no one, I don't like the idea that someone or something has already determined my course. Although I do feel that with those infinite universes happening simultaneously, that every single possible choice that I could have made in my lifetime will have been made in at least one of those, existences. So so the full spectrum of every choice that it could have possibly been made for every single human being will. We're just happening to be inhabiting one particular timeline. If that makes sense. That was
it does. No, it's not out there to me. I think I have to, because I'm a counselor educator training, accredited students and all that. I don't have a lot of experience. I don't have any experience on like the psychedelic therapies that you're talking about. And I know you're a big advocate for such. I think talking about alternative universes makes perfect sense to me. And as a counselor with, licensure and all of that, what I'm thinking about is not only can our clients access that and understand it, but where does their sense of power come from as well? Where can choice also be relevant for them? So thinking that this is what life has assigned me today. And I try to do that every day, saying, you know what, I might not be in the best headspace, energy level, this might have came up, something like that. But this is where I am. Can we teach them to live, like Dale Carnegie would say, like in date type compartments? Can we say, what's the data that we have today and where are the choices that we have to make here? And that's one of the existential angst. So maybe I should go and just touch on that when it comes to Yalom's work and the 4 existential anxieties, which he considers, and I agree, happen for every human being, whether you are a psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, pastor, astronaut, it doesn't matter. But we all go through these different levels of anxieties. And one being, okay, so I wrote a couple of when you were talking talking about this earlier, Shane. So meaninglessness is a big existential anxiety, meaning literally, what is my impact on the world? It is what I'm doing here of good, whether that be career or family influences or how we're interacting with our children or our friendships or our siblings. Am I doing something well? Am I doing something good? Am I going to leave some type of legacy, perhaps? Okay. So any of all of these four, by the way, we're talking about continuums. We're not talking about yes and no. We're talking about very low anxiety is saying, no, I don't feel very anxious. I'm open to that. And high anxiety being, I'm in, a midlife crisis type of situation. I don't know what my purpose is in this world. And Shane, you talked about that a little bit. So those things fluctuate over time for every human being. The other one being isolation. I think, again, that was so big and continues to be big with the pandemic and everything else happening in our lives right now. Existentialists, so Yalom or Frankel, somebody that is really big on understanding this well, would say you enter this world alone and you die in this world alone, or you enter and you exit alone. Okay, so even though your actual birth mother is present for your birth, your soul comes into this world by itself. And no matter how many people are around you, when you exit this physical world, you still go alone. Okay, so that is something that is really hard. We're in a death-denying Western culture in the United States, and we don't like to talk about that. Okay, we like to bring up, Shane, remind me to talk about anticipatory grief later, if we get a chance to, but yeah, we don't talk about that as something to lean into. We talk about that as something to avoid. So those two, responsibility, and this is what came up for me, why I didn't want to lose it. Responsibility and choice go hand in hand. So this idea of I'm driving to the grocery store and I have a choice to stay in my lane and operate my vehicle safely and get there and get out safely without hurting anybody else. I have the responsibility to paying bills. I have a responsibility to making sure my baby doesn't suffocate because I left a pillow in the crib. Okay, that raises so much anxiety for individual people. And that continues throughout a lifetime. Just the minute little pieces of existential anxieties and choices when it comes to that. So we either have high or low, and that fluctuates over time. And I think the big one for me, my research base, is death anxiety. I think that is absolutely huge, especially in the United States. We don't like to talk about death as being a finite end to a human existence or a life on this planet where we can tangibly understand it. That is absolutely present all the time. You think about, seeing roadkill on the side of the road. You think about the fall coming up and leaves starting to fall from trees. You see a dead bug, because it got trapped in the window and it died on its own. We're reminded of our finiteness in this world all the time. And we avoid it. And I think that raises anxiety when we avoid it, rather than leaning into it, understanding it, trying to build a level of appreciation for it as opposed to aversion towards it. That was a big talk.
No,
yeah, Shane, you go.
That's definitely something that I also try and bring into my therapies too. It's just questioning everything, really, like helping clients learn. Part of this is learning how to think, and questioning, your beliefs, questioning what you've been told about death, questioning what you think about it, and trying to explore other pathways to understand it. I know for me, I don't even know when I made that switch. Like, it's kind of weird for me. Like, I was born on Halloween, and so I always had this connection growing up with that holiday, right? And all the horror movies and gruesomeness that came along with that time of season. I sort of associated as part of my identity too, because I associated with my birthday, right?
Sure.
So I think probably through middle school, high school, even the first 2 years of undergraduate, I knew I was pursuing psychology as a profession, But I was more interested in forensic psychology and learning how to catch serial killers. And I was interested in
Yeah, DNA
deviancy,
research.
yeah, deviancy behaviors and rape and why are people evil? These kinds of questions and things like that. And it was kind of gruesome things. And
Yeah.
then I think I had some experiences that brought me to what I perceived as being on the verge of stepping over to the other side, or near death experiences, or things like that. This sort of totally changed my interest in psychology away from, what are all the ways that people, show up as less than their perfect selves in this world, switching that around to, being interested in what are our human potentials, and seeing that we all go through pain in life, but some of us come out of it better for it, and some of us use it as, I don't know, use it as an excuse to go down, or not even use it as an excuse. Fall
Well, it's more of
victim to
that
our downfall.
association of control,
Yeah,
am I in
totally.
control or am not? And
Yeah.
that I'm in it only because I don't know the reference of the quote. I might have to tell you, Shana, you tell it to your listeners later, but pain being inevitable and
Mhm.
suffering being optional,
Yeah, that's a
right?
great one. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and that suffering is the choice point, right? The
Mm-hmm.
agency point that everyone
Mm-hmm.
has, but not everyone realizes that they have, right? Like,
Yeah.
pain and
Mm-hmm.
suffering is going to happen, but how we choose to perceive it and use it, either for our downfall or for getting
Mm-hmm.
us getting us stronger. I think
And what is it serving us either way?
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, anticipatory grief.
Oh
Tell me
yeah.
about this.
Thank you for writing that down.
Sure. I think we,
uh,
I think we've all experienced that, but not everyone has heard that term. So I think this is going to bring a lot of clarity to some experiences that everyone has.
yeah, you're right. And hopefully you're right. I know you're right. I don't know how that will resonate with everybody that hears this. Oof. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of my Kylie's history, right? From second grade through the only person in my graduating class that I knew of whose parents got divorced. And then all of a sudden my dad died of acute cancer a couple of years later. And from diagnosis to death was 4 months. And I remember that being a very, very silent time. So that was during my master's program, my first graduate degree in counseling. Nobody knew what to say.
Mhm.
Okay. So think about westernized culture as well. When somebody dies, we bring casseroles, we bring cards, we bring checks, which also baffled me when that started to happen because I was put in charge. I was my father's power of attorney. So I was getting checks. Oh, so relationship with money would be another very different conversation. But this idea of the support really floods in when death happens. But for 4 months, everybody knew in my close circles and in most of my family circles and friendship circles that my dad was in palliative care, that this was not going to end in survival, that he would be dying. Yet that seemed to be the most lonely time for me, that people did not want to reach out and talk to me or sit with me. And I through research and thinking through this, and this is why this ended up being the topic of my dissertation study, is because our own personal discomfort with death prevents us from being available for people emotionally while they're on the cusp of something very traumatic and grieving. My hypothesis, and part of this, and this was shown statistically to be true, that notification of terminal illness is a traumatic experience that is something that should be supported. And oftentimes in Western culture, it is not. We wait till death. We wait till casserole time, right? So I don't want to make that to be a little bit too stereotypical, So anticipatory grief being, this could be, I don't know, Shane, if you think about what your reference point, what might be for anticipatory grief other than death, because it can be a couple of different things. But what comes up for you when you just hear that phrasing? And I know we've talked about that.
Sure.
And I know you have your own personal experiences with such. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, what comes to my mind is like first is death. And not necessarily human death. It's interesting, is because I think in my anticipation, all factors being the same, and realizing the health of every individual and factoring out accidents happening,
Yep.
probably my dog Tank is probably the closest person or the closest being that
So,
we are anticipating passing away. So that's what came to my mind initially, and then, but other forms of anticipatory grief. Yeah, I think letting go of certain people in your life, like anticipating a breakup, or anticipating like moving from a place that you have deep ties to, right? You're
right.
you're going to be grieving the letting go process of friends and family, and not just from death, but from separation,
Mhm.
from geological relocation. So that's another one that I think of. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and
You don't have to
yeah,
pull
no,
from the
that's probably
ground,
it.
but I mean, there are other ways to conceptualize, right? And so the phrase anticipatory grief was really grounded in the early 40s, with, and this was a very, gender specific and patriarchal, that's a tough word for me to say, type of lean with military displacement. So this idea of men going into world wars and women going through anticipatory grief, knowing they wouldn't come back, or at least anticipating they would not come back.
Mhm.
That's where this research started to happen in its very early forms. But one thing to, bring it back into current time to think about why anticipatory grief is so important is there's three facets to it. There is the present grief. This person is here and they're suffering. And I remember my dad, you know, he had cancer that infected also his brains. He was having regular seizures, but he didn't recognize me anymore.
Mm.
So that was, present grief. There's past grief. So you go through past grief just like you would with sudden death, or, you lose somebody suddenly. You think about all the past memories, right? So that's always there. Anticipatory grief also includes the present, but anticipatory grief also includes the future while it's still happening, before the person has actually died, or before that sudden shift has happened, where this person won't be able to walk me down the aisle, where this person won't be here for my daughter's 5th birthday, this person or this soul won't be here when this next adventure starts for me. Okay, so that's why I think it is such an important pocket of the grief experience and to lean into. But for whatever reason, culturally as well as with research, we don't do that very well here in the United States. We don't talk about it that way. We talk about it, if you go into the card aisle, for example, think about that, right? Do you see any cards that say, "I'm sorry, your dad is near death"?
Mm.
I don't even know what you'd call that card, right? What little header you'd have on that. We don't do that here. I don't know if we do that anywhere, but just making room for seeing people when they're anticipating something hurtful, right? I think that's an important point when it comes to leaning into existential angst. We want to compare ourselves. We want to say we're not one of them. We're not hurting in this way. And that comparison and just separation of them versus us provides intermittent relief, but it's not necessarily a goal
Mhm.
in common consciousness. And
So it's almost in our culture, it's almost become a bit of a self-defense mechanism, right? Like
sure,
you use it,
protection.
yeah, you use it to separate yourself
Yep.
from existential questions about your own mortality, because
Mm-hmm.
people don't like to go there, right?
No.
Yeah, and that's fascinating too. I'm sure you've done and I would love to hear, how you prefer to explore your consciousness, because people do it in different ways. But for me, like, it was a game changer when I moved from a place of, my conditioning and fear-based thoughts of death, and I moved into a place of curiosity and how other cultures
Mm-hmm.
approach death and think about it and philosophize about it. Western psychology and philosophy is just
Yep.
but one branch, but that's all we're exposed to. And
Yeah.
I loved looking into, like, Buddhist rituals around death, and Hinduistic, and like what they do with bodies in India, and how they treat them, and how they treat death within the caste system, and like all these different things,
which could be celebrated in other parts of the world, but here we fear that. It's very dark.
Yeah. And so for me, like, I've adopted for myself like some joy around not in a masochistic way, but thinking about death in that way. When I hear about family members or friends of friends that have died, and someone else is suffering, like I try and be with someone in their suffering with them, like, I'm here with you to support you, but also like I'm happy for your loved one that passed on, because it should be something celebrated. And we don't know what's after this, but I know, for me personally, I know that it's not necessarily the end. And so, I try and bring that positive outlook on death. And from what I found, the more I look into it, the more I meditate on death, the more I think about what it means to die physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, and how I have little deaths every single day in my life.
Right.
Create me anew. Like, every time I think about it, I feel like it takes the power out of that condition. It makes death so much more comfortable and more friendly, as if, because it's guaranteed, right? Why not befriend the thing that is going to take you out, right?
Out of this plane of understanding. No, I love that. And Shane, as you're saying that, I understand you, and I understand, the reason that we're talking about this together, because we have a likeness there. And if we were to say this amongst like any random sample within the United States of 100 people, 78 of them would hate hearing about this, right? They would, and I say hate loosely, they would be reluctant.
They change the topic back to a surface level thing.
Yes. And I think that's why we talk about these things openly when it comes to mental health. And I know you have the spirituality element, and I also embrace that. But I think from my professional perspective, I don't want to speak and overspeak to just personal pieces. Saying that, I will add, though, just a personal story. It doesn't have to speak to professionalism. You brought up Tank, and I've met Tank. I met Tank in his very, very first moments of his life. And and Shane knows my dog Macy, that died very suddenly to an autoimmune issue that was unexpected and very, 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 very quick. And Macy, my dog, I don't know if I said that part. It's a human name, so maybe people might think it otherwise, but the trauma of that loss was so hard, but so educational and enriching in the same way for so many different reasons. And it took me so much lean in to get to that place of not just the silver lining thing, because I don't want that to become defense mechanism stuff. I want that to be something that's embraced. This idea of there is something I can actually improve upon in my life, or I can actually gain from this loss. And I sought out a psychic, a pet psychic, a world-renowned pet psychic, because I read within that week of her loss, I read 4 different books on pet loss, because I was absolutely grounded, devastated by what was happening. By the grace of the universe, it happened to be on spring break week, so I did have a week to do that. But I reached out to this person, and I think everybody, and Shane, you can chime in on this, just because your belief systems and other ways that we access universal truths might be different from mine, but I do believe in specific abilities, and abilities that not all of us do own or appreciate all the time. That was so healing for me, and there were many reasons that it was healing for me, but I needed that. I needed that to mean that it's not all just nothing, right? And I think that's what we do, whether we reach out to support from people like that or not. We go through a loss, or we go through a sudden change, such as that, when we're losing a loved one, we want answers, or we want a little bit of comfort. So yeah, that got me choked up a little bit. So Shane, I don't know what your thoughts are there with just this idea of medication and psychedelics versus, people that have those abilities, and where you stand on that. I'd be curious just to hear your thoughts.
I don't think psychedelics give us special abilities, but I do think that psychedelics can reveal to us special abilities that we've always had, but that we have either forgotten about or not learned how to foster and train. There was actually a really interesting, it was like a fieldwork, really extensive fieldwork study by this archaeologist a few years ago that came out, and they had determined from ancient scriptures and all these other things is that way back in human history, they believe that human beings, so everyone's familiar with our five senses today, right? Sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. We have other senses too that we have names for, like our sense of time, our sense of balance, our sense of all sorts of things. So we have all these senses, but this archaeologist believes that back in the day, human beings used to have like over 300 different senses, including things like telepathy, or being able to connect with the spiritual realm, or levitation, or whatever, because we perhaps had a different understanding of physics and the laws of the universe back then, that we were able to sort of engage more of those abilities. And then over time, he said that over time, with different periods, industrialization and all these other things, that we sort of lost our connection to a lot of those senses in favor of just the ones based mostly on for survival. So I do believe that there's people out there that are either born with or develop different senses. Psychic senses is one of them. Talking to the dead is probably another one. I don't believe that when people die, they just go away like that. You can't create or destroy energy. So the energy behind that person is still around. And when an energy disperses from a single point, it spreads throughout the universe entirely equally in every direction, right? And so it makes sense that some people maybe are able to shift their their frequency a little bit to be able to access a dimension in which that person is still accessible there, or that puppy is still accessible there.
So or soul. It doesn't have to be a human versus animal soul.
Yeah, totally.
It's energy.
That energy, that presence, and that's ultimately what I think of when I think of consciousness as a term, is this energy, this it's almost like an energy that is also a database for storage. Whereas consciousness is different than the mind, which the mind is what engages consciousness. It's the tool in which we look at consciousness through. And then the brain is different from the mind, which is different from consciousness. So very much. I like picking apart all those things because not everyone realizes those differences, and we can have impact on all three different levels, right? We can have impact on the consciousness level, the mind level, and the physical brain level for a lot of these things. Sorry, I went off on a diatribe, but
no, you're fine.
I wanted to ask you about okay, in general, like universal truths, right? You and I are down with finding answers to universal truths. And something that I think is a little bit of a difference between us, but maybe I'm wrong, is that, and it's not, it's a piece of our conditioning that we fall into. But from what I'm finding is that most people, at least here in the West, go about finding universal truths through the pathway of philosophy, right? Like you said, like we study case studies, or we study other people's experiences and reports, and then we put together a theory and a philosophy to what's going on, and then that's how we move forward with our understanding. Whereas I think my preferred route to finding universal truths is not like, the philosophy is good. It provides me structure and language. But for me, the experiential path is more fruitful for me for finding universal truths. And that's akin to, whether it's my martial arts practice or my
Right.
meditation practice or my psychedelic practice or whatever, like having these experiences of self from different perspectives and different angles, that's sort of more valuable to me in my understanding. Way more valuable than even scientific papers that have been replicated, because my experience is undeniable to me. So what is your take on that when finding universal truths, taking the philosophy path or taking the experiential path, versus maybe a combination of the two? Like, what does it been for you?
Oh, great question. I know you had to take a sip of water because I did too to get started for that. But I think philosophy really did, like I said before, much earlier, really guided our understanding of existentialism. Philosophy did, of course, because we only had philosophy, we didn't have research back in early times. Scientific theory, psychological theory. The reason that I do, not just professionally, because I'm a licensed person that is endorsing such, I'm teaching my students in counselor education programs to be able to understand anything like that. All of such. That is important to me. And I do believe in it. It is not something that I'm forcing. Maybe because you said we disagree. I don't think we disagree. I think that experiential process is important. Contextually, when we try to, base treatment plans, and I don't say plans as in this is what we're going to do next, but this is what conceptually could be happening for somebody. So I think, mood disorders that have, potential mania present there, or maybe there is a little bit more chronic issue with psychopathy, where somebody is expressing lack of empathy entirely, and that's starting to infiltrate into other parts of their life. If it is trauma related, they've experienced something very acute. We just went through 9/11 and I've had a lot of, 9/11 anniversary, and I've had a lot of conversations about survivors of such. And I used to have somebody come in when I was working at IU. She grew up in New York. One of her parents was in Tower 1. One of her parents was in Tower 2.
Wow.
Both of them survived because they were out voting that day. Only reason they survived.
Wow.
Yeah. And none of their colleagues survived. None of them on either side of such. She was in a school system where, body parts were raining down on the building and her classmates have trauma, so thinking about where the acute sources of distress are happening, but really when it comes to, and that's the reason I brought up the DSM, and I will just reach for it just because we're here. When it comes to the DSM-5, and with a virtual background, I know that's hard to see, but my applaud for this versus the DSM-4 was categorical. DSM-5 is dimensional. So it says how many dimensions of a person's function in everyday life, whether that be, I know the sun is changing and so is my face. I'm just fading into the mountains. This is very existential in itself. Are they able to maintain relationships with their family? Are they able to go to work? Are they able to sleep? Are they able to do all these different things? That's really where the diagnostic part comes from. I don't look at symptoms. I look at overall functioning first. I look at symptoms as, where categorically do we go to start, but how much is your symptomology really present there? I don't know if that, I'm distracted by this like diamond on the top of my head with the sun right now, Shane. So I don't know if that addressed any of the question that you presented, but it's not necessarily about just philosophy of where do we start, but also if a client were ever to come back to me to saying, why did you choose this route versus this route? I want to have some theoretical backing for that. I want to have some agency behind that and some science behind that, as opposed to, well, this also reminds me of something that I went through, or somebody said something of such, Yeah,
that, the light behind you is
I know it's really weird now.
It looks very interesting for those of you just
now I've changed the shape of my mountain of my head into different things. I'm gonna go. You go ahead and stop. I'm gonna go shut my window.
Okay.
Or you go ahead and keep going.
Yeah, so for those of you just listening, like it was funny because the sun behind her was changing, and on her background it made her form on the Zoom podcast look translucent. So we're talking about existential things, and she started to literally fade into her background and look a little bit like a ghost. Um, yeah, so no,
I'm just going to put it downward.
Yeah,
there we go.
No worries. It definitely, it makes sense. So I guess this leads me into my like sub question around this. So philosophy versus experiential, I believe that, all philosophy initially comes from someone's experience, right? Someone
And
experienced,
replicated
right?
over some time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I think that having the experience can be a lot more informative than reading about some philosophy, right? Like having an existential experience, like
Mhm.
I no longer need people to explain it to me because I just been through it,
Mhm.
And so this leads me to the question, how do you personally prefer to explore your own consciousness? Like how do you intentionally engage in personal self-exploration as far as at the consciousness level?
Yeah. No, great question. And it's not just because I am, ethically bound by counselor education and KCREP, as well as, our current licensure laws for my different certifications and licenses. It's not just because of that I'm saying I don't use psychedelic, influence. I don't do that. I read more than anybody I know. Maybe I can say Michael Singer is my favorite author. And if you've not read The Untethered Soul, absolutely you need to do that. And it's existential, but it's so just more than that. I do love podcasts. I'm a little bit novice to podcasts totally, but I have an Audible subscription. I also Mind Valley Academy. It seems like I have endorsements from these people to tell you about this, but that's a general question. So Mind Valley Academy has free webinars from experts in personal growth and exploration and consciousness and all of that come out weekly, if not daily. I have a year-long subscription with them, so I can see all of it. That is something I do every day. So try to do every day. I'm gonna put that. Sometimes it doesn't work, but what I try to do is set up a routine. I think routine exploration of our own consciousness and our place in the world and where we're at mentally and emotionally and physically is so important. So my goal is to wake up every day. I let my dogs out. We have a routine with breakfast. I make my coffee or my tea, and I set aside at least an hour for personal growth, reflection time. I listen to a webinar. I do whatever I can to learn more about the world other than just something that's, adding to my professional growth. I want to grow personally. And I like to honor that as something that's not just about my job.
Sure.
It's about Kylie. Right. Yeah. And so that's really where it starts. So I try to do exercise for an hour a day as well, but that can be something Shane talks to you more about because he's more committed to that than I am. But yes, personal growth.
Yeah. So, it sounds like a lot of how you take that in is through, educational varieties, whether it be reading or webinars or something like that. So once you take in that information though, what do you do with it then? Do you run sort of like mental simulations, thought experiments on how you would implement new information into your daily life, as far as like how you think about yourself in reality? In because whenever I read, that's how I make the most sense of it. Is not just because it's hard to just like immerse yourself in a nonfiction book. It's not a fiction book that way. So I'll take a chapter and then I'll reflect on it a bit, and I'll think about, well, how do these things show up in my life? How could I change them for the better? Things like that. And then I also, I use jujitsu practice as a way to explore my consciousness and implement things that I've read. And so that way I'm not just reading information, but I'm trying to find connections and direct application to either situations that happen or circumstances that I put myself in training or things like that.
Yeah, it seems like your practice is a lot more applicable as, physical, right? You take that elsewhere. And for me, I am such a huge fan of succinct, sometimes they're long, but succinct quotes that I read from so many people or hear people say. I have my fridge with multiple different whiteboards that if something comes up, I write it down. I have journals packed with quotes. And what I really, really love, and I'm not saying that this works for everybody, but I love, this is the academic in me. I cite the source. So I say, where did this come from? Maybe it's Shane LeMaster in this podcast right now, and what date it is, because when I flip through it, I try to do that randomly throughout the whole journal. And just, that is my quote unquote Bible. So when I wake up in the morning and I maybe don't have something I want to listen to, I just open that and I start flipping through quotes and reminders of where I was 5 years ago. If I see something that was 9/22/16, where was Kylie then? And why did this stick out to her? And how is that speaking to me now? That's very much part of my process. I've actually said this to myself, never out loud. So there you go, Shane. If my house is on fire, I think this is something I think people think about. What are the things you grab first? My dogs, for sure. They're number one. Before I go even to my passport and my purse, I go to that journal. And I don't know what that means, but it is so important to me, and it's built over so many years. It really is precious to me. So it is application, it's reflection, and alongside the quote journals, Shane, I have a process journal. So I write down like just phrases and things that people are using, not just quotes, but just like ideas, think about this. And I flip through that as well. So I make these like ongoing parts of just my mental health and practice.
Yeah. So that's what I was kind of referring to, is like, that's how you answered it. That's how you explore your consciousness, is through taking in of new information, but then reflecting on it. And I love how you have a record of it, right? Not the quote journal, but the process journal. That way you're not rethinking the same thoughts over and over again. You're building on them. I do I have a quote journal too. I use it very much the same way, but I don't put dates by mine. When I flip through mine, I like to believe, and this is also my belief around the shuffle feature on any iPod or
what quote pops up for you
whatever
today.
quote pops up, that I was meant to read that thing, just like on shuffle. Like I hardly ever skip songs that come up on shuffle, even if I don't necessarily want to hear it, because
I like that.
I tell myself, like, this is what the universe put in front of me, and this is what I'm supposed to listen to. So I don't need to exert my control.
Yeah, even if you're like, enough of this song, I don't want to hear this one again. You're leaning into that, saying there's a part of the song, or at least a reason that I'm here right now.
It's interesting. You said in a fire, what would you save? And I think I've thought about that myself too, and I'd save my dogs first, obviously. But actually, in my last move into the house we're in now, I put all my jujitsu gis into one box, and I wrote on the box. I wrote, in case of fire, save this box first.
Oh, I love that, Shane. That's awesome.
And my jujitsu coach helped me move that day, and he saw that and took a picture of it and posted it on our gym chat.
And that means a lot to you. When you talk about it, brings emotion to you. Yeah,
totally. And it's those jiu-jitsu gis are not just fabric to me. Like, they represent a lot of struggle and overcoming struggle and finding myself and finding myself among community. And it's more than just a piece of fabric to me. Like, they embody so much more. And I don't know, I can get into that for a while, but
they have history though, but that brings a sense of you.
Yeah.
Right. If you were to save anything, obviously the living souls that bring that to you, but also the memory and what that all means to you in that box. That's not just a box.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple, how you doing on time?
I'm fine. I know I'm sitting like upright to make you not blinded.
Okay.
If I go back here, but I'm fine. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, good. So there's a couple, I want to kind of digress away. We've been talking about really deep stuff for the last hour and a half, and I so appreciate that because we like deep conversations.
Sure.
And I'm not going to bring it all the way to surface level, I promise, but there are some,
It's okay if you do, but I'll mention if it's going to be coming too.
yeah, there are less deep, but still important things that I've been exploring in my own life that I know you've been through that I just want to get your perception on. So you have been through a PhD program. I am currently going through a PhD program. I watched you go through quite a bit of your PhD program. So I know a little bit from the outside going into it, like some of the existential pain, some of the emotional,
some of the just really, really hard, crazy emotions that go with that. Sure.
And it wasn't just about the work. Like the work was fun. And that's what I found as well. Like the work is work, writing papers and reading articles. That's kind of fun for people who love to learn. But the other levels that happen to us as we go through these programs, I got to watch happen to you and totally was not expecting what I saw. And then knowing what you went through, I signed up for one myself and am currently in the middle of my program, at some big crossroads. And, I have felt at times like you've mentioned, like you just get who you thought you were gets ripped apart. Your identity gets ripped apart. You question everything. And then you have to put it back together and it's very painful. So I was wondering, can you recall, it wasn't too long ago that you were a student still. Can you recall, what it was like for you going through those 4 years?
And I think you're speaking to specifically doctoral work. Shane.
The program.
And you and I touched base just briefly before we started tonight with, academia and what that means. And I knew, so my program was counselor education, knowing I would go into academia, and that was different for you. And I think when, I don't know where to start. Because I really have appreciation, but there was a lot of, I think people use the term imposter phenomenon pretty loosely. That could be with master's programs, that could be in a trade school environment, that could be with anything. The transition into actual application of academic work versus learning about it and practicing it with constant supervision, it really is just a struggle to know and trust yourself in your own path. You pass the classes, you have the dissertation approved, you've done all of that. There's something with all of these people that are giving you the plus sign or the stamp of approval that you have to lean into and trust, because originally you're not going to. Okay, when you're actually in, and Shane, maybe you want to talk about more the end product as you are. I know you're in dissertation mode right now, or if you want to focus more on what it's like to enter into a doc program, you can help me guide that a little bit, because it is a very long and emotional process.
Well, I think everyone in my cohort was small. It was like 7 or 8 of us. Everyone in my cohort at some point or another talked in class about feeling that imposter syndrome, like feeling like they may not be smart enough, or they, do they really belong there, or are they going to be able to finish, and all these things. And I think it still continues for some of my classmates. I'm not exactly sure because I haven't asked them, but I think it is. For me, like it was a little different. Like I felt like I belonged there from day one. And it's since that starting date that I have actually begun to question some of those questions, right? And I know I'm, I know I'm smart enough to do this stuff. I know that my work ethic is strong enough, but I've had some illusions sort of shattered about what academia is and what it means
Okay.
to have these degrees and things like that. And, in along the same lines as like what we were talking about before with DSM, like
Yeah.
these educational structures, although they're changing and they're changing for the better, it's going to be a really long process before it is ideal. And a lot of these systems were designed by white privileged
Yeah.
men in order to hold up an already uplifted class system, and I don't feel like I want to participate in that. And so that's where my
Okay.
passion
So you have
comes
some
in.
resistance that
Yeah,
folds into that.
yeah, so I've chosen to not go into academia. I still want to do research, probably for a private psychedelic research company in the future. Um, but at times I've questioned, like, I know I can do this work, but do I really want to give into this system? Do I really want to? And so right now I'm like, yes, like in order to accomplish the things that I want to accomplish with my education and in my life in general, like this is the path that needs to be taken. I have to play by the rules. I have to play within the system. And then I get a choice afterwards. So right now in my doc program, I'm at the point where I'm done with classes and I've started my comprehensive exam. So I'm kind of right in the middle. And then I'll be proposing for
Which
dissertation.
differs between universities and programs. I know we chatted about that a little bit too, right? But different challenges.
Yeah, and I wanted to, so I brought that up because I wanted to ask you about that. So my exam is a 40-page paper, pretty much, a systematic literature review along with a theory section and design for an experiment and research questions. So it's like a mini dissertation project in 40 pages. That's what the assignment was. But yours wasn't yours a 2-day, 8-hour exam, something like that?
Yeah, so different. Touching on, I know we're within our last couple of minutes here, but touching back on why get a PhD?
Yeah.
I know I've spoken to you about this very explicitly, and I have for students over the past decade as well. They say, I want to go into my doctorate. I want to go into my doctorate. And I literally say, why?
Yeah. Is it
because that's important.
Yes.
Yes, it's important. I would say in my experience with cohorts that I have been a part of, if your why is, I just want to keep going, I like school, and I want to be called doctor someday, it's either A, not going to work out, we're not going to finish, or B, you're not going to be happy when you finish. So I cannot emphasize that enough. And that, Shane, I'm glad we're talking about the differences in profession. So are you counseling psych at CSU? What is your program title?
Yeah, program is social work.
Okay, your social work doctoral program. Yeah. Knowing, what are, the student success rates, but not just success, but what research did they publish? What were their dissertations? What are the faculty doing? Is that speaking to your passion? Is so much more important than, yes, I like school, and yes, I want to be called a doctor someday. Yeah, I think that's absolutely huge. So I probably have more things to say, but I know Shane and we've had that talk before.
I would say that that's my number one piece of advice too, if anyone is looking into it, is do your research on the faculty. That's the main reason why I'm even in the social work program at CSU, is because I'd been applying for the psychology program for 5 years straight and didn't get in. But then I met a professor in the social work department who happened to have the same interests in psychedelic assisted psychotherapies and future potentials for that I did. And so that's how I found myself in the social work department.
You found your family.
Exactly. Well, at least I found one mentor, probably one of the.
You found your starting family.
Yeah, exactly.
The full profession will be your family moving forward.
Yeah, and well, that's been a little challenging, but also a little exciting for me too. That there are so few professors on campus that even know about this research that I'm doing, let alone doing it themselves. And from what I've heard, my research may be one of the first dissertations on psychedelic research that has been done since the 70s at CSU, which I'm super stoked about, that I'm opening this back up for people. But yeah, the why behind the PhD I think is so much more important. And for me, like, I think that question had always been answered, that the PhD was not the end goal. It was a means to get to my end goal, and made that path a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
And so put in the hard
Yeah.
work now in order to make my path easier afterwards. And the cohort members, I think that struggle more with that probably don't know exactly what they want to be doing afterwards,
Yeah.
or what they want to be working on. So yeah. And what was your experience in your PhD program around mentoring? Did your committee chair and everything, were they pretty hands-on with you, or were they pretty hands-off?
No, that's a good question. I think it changed a little bit over time. So I will absolutely endorse Fred Hanna, who is currently the doctoral chair, the doc program chair at Adler University in Chicago. He will forever and always be probably my number one mentor throughout this entire process of higher education and seeking doctoral work. He's not at the University of Northern Colorado anymore, where I did secure my degree, but he was the one that turned me on to existentialism and thinking about this and thinking about death and dying and what does this mean? How can we measure it? How can we study it? I think it changes, it changes to specialty with faculty and with academia. You have to, I don't want to say court, but you have to understand the reasons that they are all in a why as well. So each individual faculty person, if you were to be in a doctoral program where you have to have an outside representative, maybe two, depending on program, you want to understand their whys. You don't want to just like cold call, hey, I need a person. You want some unity in that. So I think I was very much supported. Also, thinking about qualitative versus quantitative, you want to think about that. So if anybody here listening is an academic or in an academic doctoral role, and Shane, maybe you can talk about this. We touched on it a few months ago when we discussed maybe a research question or methodology. But if you have a chair that is more qualitative, or if you have a chair that's more quantitative, maybe there's either a co-chair opportunity there, or maybe a switch might be relevant for you. Okay, so making sure your methodology is really locked tight for dissertation is important for completing the entire program. Okay. And just put that out there, and Shane, you can provide feedback on it. But I think that is very much a thing. I think support for me was very well established, but getting expertise in certain things that I needed was a different conversation.
Yeah. And I like this part about it, but they really put that onus on the student.
Okay.
To form their team around them. I mean, the department is great. They help students out in every which way that they possibly can, but they also expect us to learn how does a professional conduct themselves? Well, a professional handles whatever needs to be handled. So when we are tasked with choosing our committee, we have free reign to choose whoever we want. And we can choose only people who agree with us, or we can choose people who are going to challenge us. I made my choices based off of, number one, my committee chair having a basis in the literature and knowing what I'm talking about. She's my guiding light. And then I picked another person for their methodological expertise in quality work. I picked another person. My outside member is the department chair of the philosophy department, because I took a metaphysics of self class with him in my doc program, and his understanding of transpersonalism and sort of the theories that I'm working with, I thought that was important. And then my last one is my my department chair, or my director, my course director. And she's great all around, as far as like making sure that I'm taking care of the social work aspect. So I chose my members very specifically, but at times I've found myself wanting a bit more hands-on or personal interest in my project and what I'm doing from them. But I also realized just how busy the life of an academic is, and it's got to be really hard. But I see some other professors or whatever, like really being hands-on and mentoring some of their students. And sometimes I wish I had that, but
Yeah.
I also enjoy the freedom of not getting emails every week wondering what
Where
your
is
progress
this?
is.
Where
Yeah,
are you at with such?
they just trust
Yeah.
me. They're like, okay, he'll get it done, you know.
Yeah. And I can say from 10 years now, being in higher education as a faculty member, I've never had doctoral students before. So we have not had a doctoral program. We've only had a master's program. So I can speak from application parts for that. But yeah, getting support and knowing how much autonomy you have and how much support you really do need, no matter where you're at, to have a voice to say, I need help. And that was one of the very first feedback things I remember from my first year in doctoral work, before dissertation, before deciding what I was going to do with my life and career. You know, one of our professors said, you have to tell us what you need because we can't guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we only know so much. So if anybody here is listening and thinking about, you know, how do I find a mentor, what that looks like, you do have to be a pretty proactive voice in all of that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the last little bit that I wanted to bring up, and this is, you know, as we're coming out of the deep waters, we're moving back into the shallower end, but still important. Just real quick, I mentioned in your intro today that you're a longtime doggy foster mom, or you were, and you've always had dogs as a part of your life, and how I've known you, and so have I. And I just wanted to talk very briefly about your take on dogs and their effects on our lives, and what it's been like fostering, right? And as I speak of this right this second, I'm thinking about all the multiple instances of anticipatory grief you had to go through
Oh gosh,
getting a puppy
50.
and knowing that you're going to have to get rid of, not get rid of, but adopt out this doggy
Yes.
and that you've formed bonds with. That's got to be extremely
But I
difficult.
have had fosters that had had physical ailments that died in my care. So I mean,
Wow.
there's a little bit of both. Yeah.
Yeah.
The change in light is hard. I'm gonna put these back
No,
on.
it's fine. One of my committee members actually published something during the pandemic. It was a research study done about pets and COVID, and how having a pet significantly reduces senses of isolation and improves well-being in the pandemic context. So
Yeah. Ugh. So many layers to it. I've always been a huge animal advocate. And for people that might be listening to this thinking, oh, I don't like dogs, or I'm not a pet person, I think what Shane's speaking to here is still valid and important to think about how either pets or associated relationships really impact our lives and how we conceptualize that. Yeah, I went from teaching, I lived about 35 minutes away from my university, teaching 3 nights a week, had all these meetings throughout the week. I was basically away from home all the time, but I had a fenced in backyard and a dog door, and I really just hoped my pets would be okay. And, they were. I mean, physically, they were fine. And then all of a sudden, March 2020 came along, and the pet rescue that I had been affiliated with, I've been fostering for about 1.5 years at that point, but one dog at a time, just taking them to training classes and doing all of that. Anybody that would comment, if I post a picture, they'd say, how do you say goodbye? And I think that's what Shane's referring to as well. How do you say goodbye? What was best for me, what was so helpful for me, is one of my first days just training to be a volunteer, not just a foster mom, but training to be a volunteer. I went into the shelter, and one of the long-term volunteers there, the program I worked with, everybody's a volunteer. Nobody gets paid a dime. We were associated with the shelter. Nobody gains a single cent from this. It's all their hearts, which was humbling enough. But walking through, that was the part I'm like, I don't know if I can walk through. I don't know if I can walk through all of that, hundreds of dogs, homeless, living in crates and that type of thing. And it wasn't crates, it was runs, and it was a lot more pleasant than I thought it would be. But she looked at me and she said, if they wouldn't be here, they'd be dead. Does that help you? And I was affiliated with a rescue that was no-kill rescue. That's different. So knowing that part, and I don't want to get long-winded on that, Shane, but you brought that up as a very big passion point for me. That was a great grounding phrase for me. If they wouldn't be here, they'd be extinguished, because our rescue pulled dogs specifically from the South, because that's a very high kill area, that anywhere where a dog was at risk of euthanization just because they didn't have a home, that was the passion of our rescue. So yeah, over 50 dogs. I only had to leave one behind, knock on wood. So if anybody listening to this lives in an associated Michiana area, in the Chicago or Indiana area, my little boy Kaido is still waiting for a home. But yeah, knowing the grief of goodbye means a new beginning. Put that in more, terms for our audience here. That tears are okay. Grief is okay in celebration times as well as it is in grieving times, in sadness. That you can cry tears of excitement and loss, but also, I don't know, just this idea of hope, that I did something, that I have a role in something bigger than me. Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up at the end, Shane, as opposed to the beginning, because it does choke me up.
Sure, yeah, and I think that's a great way for us to end it right there. There were a few more things that I wanted to talk to you about, but we'll just have you back on the show another time.
Well, let's do it again.
Okay. So again, to our listeners, thank you for listening. This has been episode 103. Thank you so much, Kylie, for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It was a blast.
It was super fun.
I didn't think I could last for 2 hours, but we did it.
We covered some really good ground. And as always, I'm always left with more questions than when I started.
Yeah.
And that's the way I like to leave it. So thank you to the listeners. Thank you to Kylie. And we'll see you guys next time. The Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.